truth that needs to be established again and again and again. The immutability of Jesus Christ. It's one of the most important doctrines as Christians or followers of Jesus. It matters because if Jesus can change, then he ceases to be perfect, which means he ceases to be God. And there we know that everything is in disarray if that's true. So Jesus cannot change, will not change. And I want to talk about some of the things he's unchanging in that gives us certainty in these times of uncertainty. And so here in Hebrews chapter 13, I'm going to pick up in verse 5. I encourage you to go read the whole text, the whole chapter. But in Hebrews chapter 13 verse 5 it says this: keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. Interesting. Are we content with what we have? Doesn't mean we're not trusting for more, but if we learned to be content with what we do have, and I think part of transition, part of challenges like we're in now is helping us understand we need to learn to be content. We don't always need the more, the next. Be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you and never will I forsake you. Verse 6, he says, so we say this with confidence, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? Verse 7 says, remember your leaders, and I still think it's good for us to be reminded and remember our leaders who spoke the word of God. That's what we speak, the word of God, not some great truth or great theories or myths, but the word of God. And he goes on and says, consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. So that's a great truth to be reminded that we need to remember our leaders, we need to imitate them and their way of life and the word of God that they spoke. But then I also want to say the most important verse here in verse 8. It says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. So it's interesting how we to imitate our leaders and to remember our leaders and imitate their way of life. But the writer moves to this revelation that Jesus Christ, not your leaders, not people, but Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. I love this verse because it showcases something that I believe is often neglected, the doctrine in Christianity, is this immutability of Jesus Christ. It showcases Christ in his unchanging way. He's the same yesterday, he's the same today, and for us the good news is he's going to be the same forevermore. In simple terms, this means that Jesus has never, can never, and will never change. He is by his very nature unchangeable. Meaning that he is as powerful as ever. He is as loving as ever. He's as merciful. He's as full of grace. And he is as holy and as much in control today as he's ever been and will ever be. Let that sink in, friends, because when things are shaken, in uncertain times, we begin to question that. But let this truth sink into our hearts, into our minds, and into our lives, that Jesus Christ is in full control. And even when we come through these times, he's still in control. And it's easier to believe that when things are going really well, far more difficult. But I want to just remind you, Jesus isn't changing. In light of all the uncertainty, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. This doctrine is essential because it's an essential doctrine of our faith. To our faith. Why? Because change implies imperfection. And Jesus is absolutely perfect. Therefore, he cannot change ever. Revelation chapter 1, verse 8, Jesus says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. He says, the one who is, the one who was, and the one who is to come. In other words, he's unchanging. Jesus declared that about himself. And so we know that for sure, that Jesus is perfect. He never changes. And I think it's absolutely essential for us in these times to be reminded of that truth. He's absolutely unchangeable. Let that sink in.